The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, by Atul Gawande. Introduction. It was Halloween night in San Francisco. A man was rushed into the emergency room after a fight at a costume party. He had a stab wound. Now, when surgeons hear stab wound, their minds race through 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 ways things can go wrong. But this case, well, this one seemed straightforward. The man was awake, a little drunk, but stable. The wound itself was a neat 2-inch slit in his belly. It wasn't bleeding much. The trauma team did their work perfectly, a head-to-toe examination, careful tracking of his vitals, everything by the book. They decided they had time. This wasn't a mad dash to the operating room. They could prepare properly. And then, as the patient lay waiting, a nurse noticed he'd stopped his drunken babbling. He went quiet. His heart rate shot through the roof. His eyes rolled back in his head. Suddenly, his blood pressure was barely detectable. The calm evaporated. Now, it was a crash into the operating room, stretcher flying, nurses racing, the surgeon grabbing a blade and slicing down the man's abdomen in one clean, determined swipe. When he opened the man up, an ocean of blood burst out. The blood was everywhere. It wasn't a simple stab wound. The weapon had gone more than a foot deep, past the intestines, and straight into the aorta, the massive artery carrying blood from the heart. The team had done almost everything right. They had followed every protocol, checked every vital sign. But in the calm before the storm, in the seeming simplicity of the moment, everyone had forgotten to ask one simple question. They never asked the patient, or the paramedics who brought him in, what was the weapon? The man at the party wasn't dressed as a pirate with a plastic sword. He was dressed as a soldier. And his weapon wasn't a knife. It was a bayonet. That story isn't about bad doctors. It's about some of the best doctors in the world, doing their best. And it reveals a terrifying truth about the world we live in. We have more knowledge, more skill, and more technology than at any other time in human history. Yet we still fail. And we fail in ways that are heartbreaking, because they are so often preventable. The author of this book, Atul Gawande, is a world-renowned surgeon, a writer for The New Yorker, and a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. He has spent his life standing on the front lines of complexity, where the stakes are life and death. And he became obsessed with a single, profound question. In a world of staggering complexity, how do we get things right? The answer he discovered is not some high-tech gadget or a billion-dollar innovation. It's a tool so simple, so humble, it seems almost insulting. But it holds the power to prevent catastrophes, to master complexity, and to transform how we approach any difficult task in our lives. By the end of our time together today, you will not only understand this tool, but you will see the world through a new lens. You will understand the hidden reason behind our most common failures, and you will hold the key to overcoming them. This is the story of the Checklist Manifesto. Book summary. To understand the power of a checklist, you first have to understand the nature of failure. For most of human history, our failures were largely failures of ignorance. We simply didn't know enough. We didn't know what caused infections, so people died from simple cuts. We didn't know how to build skyscrapers that could withstand earthquakes, so they fell. We didn't know how to treat a heart attack, so we put patients on bed rest and prayed. These were tragic, but understandable. You can't be blamed for not knowing what hasn't been discovered yet. But sometime in the last century, a quiet shift occurred. Science filled in the gaps. We now have over 13,000 different diseases and injuries classified by the World Health Organization, and for almost all of them, we have something we can do. We have 6,000 drugs and 4,000 medical procedures at our disposal. The knowledge is there. We know how to prevent infections. We know how to treat heart attacks. We know how to build safe buildings. And yet, we still fail. But today, our failures are different. They are not failures of ignorance. They are failures of ineptitude. Ineptitude is when the knowledge exists, but we fail to apply it correctly. It's the skyscraper that collapses not because of a new law of physics, but because it was built wrong. It's the heart attack patient who doesn't get the right treatment in time, not because the treatment doesn't exist, but because in the chaos of the emergency room, a critical step was missed. This is the central problem of our modern age. The volume and complexity of what we know has exceeded our individual ability to deliver its benefits correctly, safely, or reliably. We have trained our experts, our doctors, pilots, engineers, and financiers, for longer and more intensely than ever. They are brilliant, skilled, and dedicated. But the sheer amount of knowledge they are expected to manage has become, in many ways, unmanageable. Expertise is no longer enough. This brings us to a pivotal moment in history. October 30, 1935. The U.S. Army Air Corps was holding a competition to choose its next long-range bomber. Boeing's new plane, the Model 299, was the clear favorite. It was a marvel of engineering, a gleaming flying fortress that could fly faster, farther, and carry 5 times more bombs than the Army had asked for. The competition was seen as a mere formality. The Army was ready to order dozens of them. A small crowd of Army brass watched as the plane taxied onto the runway. It roared down the tarmac, lifted off smoothly, and then, at just 300 feet, something went terribly wrong. The plane stalled, turned on one wing, and crashed in a fiery explosion. 2 of the 5 crew members died, including the pilot, Major Ployer Hill, one of the most experienced test pilots in the Air Corps. An investigation revealed that nothing mechanical had failed. The crash was due to pilot error. This new plane was just so much more complex than previous aircraft. The pilot had to manage 4 engines instead of 2, retractable landing gear, new wing flaps, and a dozen other new systems. In the middle of all this, he had forgotten one simple, crucial step. He forgot to release a new locking mechanism on the elevator and rudder controls. The verdict was damning. The Boeing model was, as one newspaper put it, too much airplane for one man to fly. The Army declared the competing, smaller plane the winner. Boeing nearly went bankrupt. But a small group of test pilots believed the plane was flyable. They got together to figure out a solution. And what they decided not to do is just as important as what they did. They didn't require more training. After all, the pilot who crashed was their chief of flight testing. You couldn't get more experienced than him. Instead, they tried something ingeniously simple. They created a pilot's checklist. It was short enough to fit on an index card. It had step-by-step checks for takeoff, flight, landing, and taxiing. It was full of what seemed like dumb stuff, simple reminders that any pilot should already know. Check that the brakes are released. Check that the instruments are set. Check that the elevator controls are unlocked. You wouldn't think it would make much difference. But with that simple checklist in hand, the pilots went on to fly the Model 299 for 1.8 million miles. Without a single accident. The Army was convinced. They ultimately ordered nearly 13,000 of the aircraft, which became the legendary B-17 bomber that gave America a decisive air advantage in World War II. The checklist wasn't a replacement for expertise. It was a tool to help expertise succeed. It was what Gawande calls a cognitive net, a simple safety net to catch the mental flaws inherent in all of us, flaws of memory, attention, and thoroughness, especially under pressure. Now, You might be thinking, that's fine for airplanes, but my work, my life, is far more complex and unpredictable. And that's exactly what doctors thought for decades. They argued that sick people are phenomenally more various than airplanes. A study of trauma patients in Pennsylvania found 1,224 different types of injuries and over 32,000 unique combinations. How could you possibly create a checklist for that? But the idea began to seep into medicine, not from the top down, but from the ground up. Think about the vital signs that hospitals record for every patient: temperature, pulse, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. That's a checklist. And it wasn't doctors who made it standard practice. It was nurses in the 1960s who designed their charts to ensure these 4 things were checked consistently. They understood that even if 3 signs looked good, the 4th might reveal a hidden danger that could cost a person their life. Still, the idea of a doctor's checklist was seen as unnecessary. That is, until 2001, when a critical care specialist at Johns Hopkins Hospital named Peter Pronovost decided to try an experiment. He wanted to tackle one specific, deadly problem: central line infections. A central line is a catheter placed into a large vein in the neck, chest, or groin. ICUs put in 5 million of them every year in the United States alone, and they are lifesavers. But they are also a major source of infection. These infections are fatal up to 28% of the time. Pronovost knew there were 5 simple steps that could prevent the vast majority of these infections. They were things every doctor had been taught for years. 1. Wash your hands with soap. 2. Clean the patient's skin with a specific antiseptic. 3. Put sterile drapes over the entire patient. 4. Wear a sterile mask, hat, gown, and gloves. 5. Put a sterile dressing over the site once the line is in. It seemed almost silly to make a checklist for something so obvious. But Pronovost first asked the nurses in his ICU to observe the doctors for a month and record how often they followed every step. The result was shocking. In more than a third of patients, the doctors skipped at least one step. So Pronovost did something revolutionary. He created a simple, one-page checklist with these 5 steps. And he got the hospital administration to authorize the nurses to stop the doctors if they saw them skipping a step. This was a profound cultural shift. It gave the nurses permission, and the power, to enforce the standard. For the next year, they monitored what happened. The results were so dramatic, they weren't sure whether to believe them. The 10-day line infection rate went from 11% down to 0. They continued tracking for 15 more months. In that entire time, only 2 line infections occurred. In this one hospital, this simple checklist had prevented an estimated 43 infections and 8 deaths, and it saved the hospital $2 million. This wasn't a fluke. When Pronovost and the Michigan Health and Hospital Association rolled out the checklist to ICUs across the entire state, the results were just as stunning. In the first 3 months, the central line infection rate in Michigan's ICUs dropped by 66%. In the first 18 months, the project saved an estimated $175 million and more than 1,500 lives. All because of what they called a stupid little checklist. This is where the story gets really interesting. Because preventing a line infection is a relatively simple problem. The steps are always the same. But what about the messy, unpredictable, truly complex situations that define so much of our work? Can a checklist help when there is no straightforward recipe? For the answer, Gawande takes us to an unlikely place, a construction site. Standing on a sidewalk in Boston, he watched a new 11-story hospital wing rising from the ground, a skeleton of steel beams reaching for the sky. And he wondered, How could they be sure this thing wouldn't fall down? The complexity of a modern skyscraper is mind-boggling. Our hospital wing, he learned, would require nearly 4,000 tons of steel, 13,000 yards of concrete, and 95 miles of electrical wire. 16 different trades, from electricians to plumbers to masons, all had to coordinate their work perfectly. How do you manage that? For most of history, building was done by master builders, a single genius who designed, engineered, and oversaw the entire project. They built Notre Dame and the U.S. Capitol. But by the mid-20th century, the master builder was dead. The sheer variety and sophistication of knowledge required had overwhelmed the capacity of any single person to master it all. The construction industry fragmented into dozens of specialties, just like medicine. But unlike medicine, the construction industry was forced to confront a hard truth. In the absence of a master builder, individual autonomy is a disaster. It produces a cacophony of incompatible decisions and overlooked errors. It produces a building that doesn't stand up straight. So, they developed a different system. And at the heart of that system were checklists. At the construction site for a massive 32-story complex in Boston, Gawande met the project executive, Finn O'Sullivan. On the walls of his conference room were two giant printouts. The first was the construction schedule. This was a line-by-line, day-by-day checklist of every single task that needed to be done, in what order, and when. It was a classic do-confirm checklist, designed to handle the complicated but predictable parts of the job. It ensured the stupid but critical stuff wasn't missed. But it was the second checklist that held the real secret. It was called the submittal schedule. This list didn't specify construction tasks. It specified communication tasks. The builders knew they couldn't predict every problem. A floor might tilt unexpectedly. A structural beam might conflict with a planned lighting fixture. Materials might not arrive on time. These are complex problems, unpredictable and uncertain. The medical way of dealing with this is to leave it to the expert's individual judgment. But the builders knew that was a recipe for failure. Instead, their second checklist forced the right experts to talk to one another at critical moments. It specified who had to talk to whom, by what date, about what specific aspect of the construction. It pushed the power of decision-making away from the center and out to the people on the front lines. It gave them the freedom to adapt and use their expertise, but it forced them to do it as a team. The philosophy was simple but profound. Man is fallible, but maybe men are less so. They trusted in the wisdom of the group. This system has produced an astonishing record of success. In the United States, we experience an average of just 20 serious building failures a year. That's an avoidable failure rate of less than 0.00002%. And they do it while building faster than ever before. The checklists work. They handle both the simple and the complex by balancing two seemingly contradictory ideas, discipline and freedom. This brings us to the climax of the story. Armed with this new understanding, Atul Gawande and his team at the World Health Organization returned to their daunting mission, to create a checklist for surgery that could work anywhere in the world, from a high-tech hospital in Seattle to a rural clinic in Tanzania. The process was painstaking. They borrowed principles from aviation and construction. They knew the checklist had to be short, simple, and practical. It couldn't be a detailed recipe. It had to be a tool that helped experts function better as a team. The final WHO Safe Surgery Checklist was a single page with just 19 checks, organized around 3 pause points. 1. Before anesthesia, the team confirms patient identity, the correct surgical site, known allergies, and readiness for potential airway problems or major blood loss. 2. Before the first incision, this is the team huddle. Everyone introduces themselves by name and role. They again confirm the patient and procedure. And then they talk. The surgeon outlines the critical steps and potential dangers. The anesthesia team reviews their concerns. The nurses confirm that all equipment is sterile and ready. This is the communication check. 3. Before the patient leaves the room, the team verbally confirms that all sponges and instruments have been accounted for, that any specimens are correctly labeled, and that there is a clear plan for the patient's recovery. To see if it would actually work, they launched a landmark study in 8 hospitals around the globe, representing a huge diversity of wealth and resources. They had a university hospital in Seattle and a charity hospital in New Delhi. They had a major academic center in London and a lone district hospital in rural Tanzania serving nearly 1 million people. First, they collected data for 3 months without the checklist to establish a baseline. The results were sobering. The rate of major complications was as high as 21% in some hospitals. And they found that basic safety steps were missed in a startling 2/3 of patients, in both rich and poor countries alike. Then, in the spring of 2008, the hospitals began implementing the 2-minute, 19-step checklist. The results came in a few months later. They were stunning. Across all 8 hospitals, the rate of major complications fell by 36%. Deaths fell by 47%. Infections fell by almost half. And the need for a second operation due to a technical problem fell by a quarter. The checklist had worked everywhere. In the high-income hospitals, complications dropped by 1/3. In the lower-income hospitals, they dropped by even more. Overall, using the checklist had spared more than 150 people from serious harm and saved 27 of them from death in just this small study. When the staff themselves were surveyed anonymously, 80% said the checklist was easy to use and had improved the safety of care. But the most telling number came from one final question. They asked the staff, if you were having an operation, would you want the checklist to be used? A full 93% said yes. The ultimate test of a checklist, however, is not in the data, but in the moments when everything goes wrong. And for Gawande, that moment came in his own operating room. He was performing an operation to remove a rare tumor from a man's adrenal gland. It was a complex procedure, but one he had done many times before without a problem. He was confident. And then, disaster struck. While dissecting the tumor, he accidentally tore a hole in the vena cava, the main vessel returning blood to the heart. It was, he says, a catastrophe. His patient lost nearly his entire volume of blood in about 60 seconds and went into cardiac arrest. Gawande had to slash open the man's chest and belly, take his heart in his hand, and begin manually pumping it to keep blood flowing to the brain. He thought it was over. He thought he had killed his patient. But they had run the checklist at the start of the case. During the pre-incision huddle, Gawande had confidently stated that he didn't expect much blood loss. But he also mentioned that the tumor was near the vena cava, so major bleeding was a theoretical risk. That was all the nurse needed to hear. She took it as her cue to double-check that blood was ready in the blood bank, just in case it hadn't been. So she made sure 4 units were prepared. That one simple step, prompted by the checklist, saved the man's life. But just as powerful was what the checklist did for the team. The operating room was filled with strangers who had never worked together before. But because they had gone around the room and introduced themselves, because they had taken a minute to talk through the plan as a team, when disaster hit, they didn't panic. They performed flawlessly. The nurse called for help and got the blood instantly. The anesthesiologist poured unit after unit into the patient. Everyone knew their role, and together, They bought the surgeon and the patient precious time. The patient survived. Because of the checklist, he was able to go home to his family. This is the power of the checklist. It is not a mindless, bureaucratic tool. It is a tool for excellence. It is a way of instilling discipline, of building teamwork, and of ensuring that we apply the vast knowledge we possess with consistency and care. It catches our fallibility. It gives us a chance to get things right. Commentary. When you first hear the central idea of the Checklist Manifesto, it can feel almost underwhelming. A checklist? That's it? We live in an age of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering, and the secret to mastering complexity is a piece of paper with some boxes on it? But that initial feeling of skepticism is precisely why this book is so profound. The greatest discoveries are often the ones that were hiding in plain sight all along. Atul Gawande didn't invent a new technology, he revealed a new way of thinking. He shows us that in our quest for brilliance, we have often neglected the importance of being methodical. The book's most powerful lesson, for me, is about humility. The enemy of excellence is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. It's the belief that because we are experts, we are infallible. The checklist forces us to confront our own fallibility. It forces the brilliant, experienced pilot to admit that he might forget to unlock the rudder. It forces the world-class surgeon to admit that, in the heat of the moment, he might overlook an allergy or forget an antibiotic. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's the ultimate sign of professionalism. It's the recognition that the systems we work within are more important than our individual egos. The true hero of the modern age is not the lone genius, the maverick who breaks all the rules. It's the person who understands that success in a complex world requires both individual skill and the discipline to function as part of a team. It's Captain Sully Sullenberger, who, in the middle of a crisis, trusted his training, his co-pilot, and his checklists. So, how can you apply this in your own life? You don't have to be a surgeon or a pilot to benefit from this idea. Here are a few simple ways to start. First, identify a recurring task in your life where mistakes happen. It could be something as simple as packing for a trip, or something more complex like completing a weekly assignment for school. We all have those moments where we think, I forgot that again. That's your target. Second, create a simple checklist for it. Don't try to list every single step. Remember what the Boeing engineers taught us? Focus on the killer items, the 5 to 9 most critical steps that are most dangerous to miss. Is it making sure your passport is in your bag? Is it double-checking the assignment's due date? Write them down. Keep it on one page or a single note on your phone. Third, decide whether it should be a read-do or a do-confirm checklist. For a recipe, you read then do. But for many tasks, a do-confirm is better. You do the task from memory, and then you pause for 60 seconds to run through the list and confirm you didn't miss anything. The goal here isn't to turn you into a robot. It's the opposite. The checklist gets the simple, boring, memory-based stuff out of your head, which frees up your mental energy to focus on what really matters, the hard stuff, the creative stuff, the unexpected problems that require your full intelligence. A checklist isn't about dumbing down work, it's about making space for smart work. That was the book summary of the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. We certainly touched on the big ideas today, but a summary is like looking at a photograph of a mountain. Reading the book is like climbing it. The real power is in the stories, the details, and the way Gawande makes you feel the weight of these life and death decisions. This summary is a map to help you decide if that climb is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked a light in you, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about gaining knowledge, it's an experience that can fundamentally change how you approach everything you do. Also, if you found this journey valuable, Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and keep growing together.